The dust cloud arrived 30 seconds before the convoy, rolling across forward operating base Kandahar like a brown curtain drawn against the afternoon sun. Captain Derek Holloway stood at the landing zone perimeter watching 3 transport trucks materialize from the haze, their engines grinding through the Wednesday heat. Supply deliveries arrived every Wednesday at 1400 hours, had for the past 8 months since he'd taken command of logistics operations. This one looked no different from the dozens before it. The second truck's passenger door swung open before the vehicle fully stopped. A woman in standard medic fatigues climbed down, her boots hitting the packed earth with careful precision. She carried a weathered clipboard against her chest like a shield, her shoulders hunched slightly forward as her eyes swept the base perimeter without settling on anything specific. Holloway recognized the posture immediately. Another green medic, fresh from stateside duty, overwhelmed by her first deployment to an active theater. The woman approached the staging area where Holloway stood reviewing delivery manifests. She kept her gaze lowered, speaking just loud enough to be heard over the idling engines. "My name is Adrian Reeves. I have the medical supply inventory for review." Her voice carried a tremor that made Holloway's jaw tighten with familiar irritation. He took the manifest she offered, scanning the list of trauma kits and pharmaceutical supplies while she shifted her weight from foot to foot. The sun blazed down at 112 degrees, turning the metal equipment around them into radiators. Sweat darkened the collar of her uniform, but she made no move to wipe her forehead or seek shade. She just stood there, waiting, her breathing slightly too fast for someone who'd only walked 20 feet. "How long until your convoy departs?" Holloway asked without looking up from the paperwork. Reeves checked her watch with a quick glance that suggested she'd already calculated the answer. 90 minutes, sir. We complete unloading in 40, inspection in 30, reload in 20. Holloway nodded, making a notation on his own clipboard. Behind him, 2 of his lieutenants approached from the command building. Marcus Webb, a stocky man with a perpetual smirk, arrived first. Philip Santos followed 3 steps behind, younger and leaner, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Both men stopped when they saw Reeves, their attention drawn by her obvious discomfort. Webb exchanged a glance with Santos that Holloway caught in his peripheral vision. It was a look he'd seen countless times, the silent communication between soldiers who recognized someone who didn't belong. Another support specialist who thought medical school prepared them for combat zones. Another person who'd rotate home early claiming stress or incompatibility with deployed life. The convoy crews began unloading the first crates. Reeves moved toward the supply staging area to verify the inventory against her manifest. She walked with her eyes down, navigating around equipment and personnel with small, careful steps. When she reached for the first medical crate, a 50-pound container of trauma supplies, she gripped it with both hands and lifted. The crate slipped. Not dramatically, just a momentary loss of grip that forced her to adjust her hold quickly. But Holloway had turned at that exact moment, his attention drawn by the scrape of cardboard against metal. His voice cut across the staging area before he consciously decided to speak. "You need help with that?" The question wasn't helpful. It was a challenge, delivered in a tone that made 3 nearby soldiers look over. Reeves's face flushed red as she repositioned her grip on the crate. "I have it, sir. Thank you." She lowered the container to the ground without meeting anyone's eyes. Holloway walked closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "Command keeps sending us people who jump at loud noises. You sure you can handle being this close to the action, sweetheart?" The endearment landed with deliberate weight, transforming a simple question into something else entirely. Reeves straightened slowly, her hands still on the crate. She looked at Holloway's shoulder rather than his face. "I'll manage, sir." Her voice had dropped even quieter than before, barely audible over the convoy engines. Webb stepped forward with a grin spreading across his face. "Captain's got a point. You dropped that crate like it bit you. Going to be a long deployment if supply boxes make you nervous." "I didn't drop it," Reeves said softly. "I adjusted my grip." "Sure looked like dropping from here," Santos added, positioning himself beside Webb. Both lieutenants now formed a loose semicircle with Holloway, their body language casual, but their positioning deliberate. 3 men, 1 woman, the geometry of the confrontation obvious to anyone watching. "Before you've been here long, I want to share something with those of you watching from wherever you are in the world, whether you're in Texas, California, Ohio, or anywhere else. These stories about underestimation and revelation, they happen everywhere, in every profession, in every community. Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you're watching from. It matters because these moments of judgment and truth aren't limited to military bases or combat zones. They happen in hospitals, offices, schools, and neighborhoods just like yours. Reeves returned to her inventory work, checking each crate against her manifest with methodical focus. She didn't respond to the comments, didn't defend herself, didn't ask the three men to step back and let her work. She just continued moving through the checklist, her pen marking each verified item with small, precise checks. From the command center, 200 yards away, Major Patricia Denning stood at the observation window with binoculars raised. She'd watched the entire exchange, her jaw tightening as Holloway's voice carried across the distance. She lowered the binoculars slowly, her fingers white against the black rubber grips. Denning had served with Adrian Reeves 6 years earlier, before Reeves joined Special Forces Group 3 and disappeared into the classified world of JSOC operations. She'd watched Reeves run 12 miles with a fractured ankle during survival training rather than ring the bell. She'd seen Reeves lead a 4-person team through a simulated hostage rescue that made veteran operators stop and study the footage afterward. And now she watched Reeves hunch her shoulders and accept verbal harassment without a flicker of the steel Denning knew existed beneath that carefully constructed facade. Because that's what cover required. That's what the mission demanded. Denning picked up her encrypted phone and typed a brief message. Package secure. No complications yet. She paused before adding, local command unaware and dismissive. Then she set the phone down and returned to the window. Below, Holloway had moved on to inspecting other deliveries, leaving Reeves to complete her inventory alone. The staging area buzzed with activity as crews unloaded water, ammunition, and fuel. Reeves worked steadily through her checklist, her head down, her movements small and economical. Every few minutes, she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, the heat turning her face red. Webb and Santos watched her from the shade of a storage container, their conversation too quiet to reach her, but their occasional laughter clear enough. When Reeves struggled to lift a particularly heavy crate onto a pallet, neither man moved to help. They just watched, their expressions mixing amusement with contempt. 40 minutes later, Reeves finished her inventory and returned to Holloway with the completed manifest. Everything verified, sir. Supplies matched the delivery order exactly. Holloway took the paperwork and glanced at it briefly. Good. You've got 50 minutes until convoy departure. Stay out of the way until then. Reeves nodded and walked toward the convoy trucks, where the drivers were conducting their own pre-departure checks. She climbed into the second truck's passenger seat and closed the door, finally alone, finally able to let her shoulders drop. Through the dusty windshield, she could see Holloway talking with his lieutenants, their body language relaxed and confident. She pulled a small notebook from her cargo pocket and made 3 quick entries. Time of arrival, names of personnel encountered, initial assessment of base security posture. Then she tucked the notebook away and leaned back against the seat, her eyes closing briefly against the glare. In the command center, Denning made one more encrypted call. The voice on the other end answered after a single ring. Status? Package arrived safely, Denning said. Local command has made contact. The situation is developing as anticipated. Understood. Maintain observation and report any escalation. The line went dead. Denning set the phone down and pulled up the base duty roster on her computer. She'd need to be available when things inevitably deteriorated. She'd need to be ready to intervene when the mission timeline demanded it. But until then, she could only watch and document. Watch and prepare. Watch and wait for the moment when Derek Holloway's assumptions would shatter completely. The convoy engines roared to life 90 minutes after arrival. Reeves emerged from the truck to conduct final departure checks, walking through the same staging area where she'd been mocked hours earlier. Holloway and his lieutenants had moved to other tasks, leaving her to complete her duties without additional commentary. The 3 trucks rolled out at 1600 hours exactly, their departure marked only by fresh dust clouds and the fading sound of engines. Holloway watched them go from the command building steps, already dismissing the shy medic from his thoughts. Just another support specialist passing through, gone and forgotten. In the command center, Denning archived her encrypted messages and updated her personal log. Day 1 complete. Package maintaining cover successfully. Local command behavior documented. She closed the log and returned to routine duties, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Knowing that Adrian Reeves would endure whatever came next with the same quiet strength that defined her approach to impossible missions. Knowing that Derek Holloway had no idea what he'd started. The mess hall at 1800 hours held 200 soldiers in various states of exhaustion and hunger. Metal trays clattered against tables as men and women moved through the serving line, their conversations rising and falling like waves. Adrian Reeves entered through the south entrance carrying an empty tray, her eyes scanning for an isolated corner where she could eat without drawing attention. She found a spot at the far end of the facility, a two-person table pressed against the concrete wall beneath a broken ceiling fan. The food on her tray looked institutional and tired. Reconstituted potatoes, chicken that had been frozen and reheated, vegetables that had lost their color somewhere between the kitchen and her plate. She ate slowly, her focus on the meal rather than the room around her. Captain Holloway's table occupied the center of the mess hall, surrounded by his usual group of 8 soldiers. Their laughter punctuated the ambient noise, loud and confident. Lieutenant Webb sat at Holloway's right elbow, gesturing with his fork while telling a story that made the others grin. Lieutenant Santos sat across from them, quieter but attentive, his posture relaxed. Webb noticed Reeves first. He set down his fork and leaned toward Holloway, saying something too quiet to carry across the distance. Holloway turned in his seat, locating Reeves in her corner, and his expression shifted into something approaching amusement. Webb stood without finishing his meal and walked directly toward Reeves's table. His boots struck the concrete floor with deliberate heaviness, announcing his approach long before he arrived. He stopped beside her table with his arms crossed, looking down at her hunched shoulders and half-eaten food. "You lost, sweetheart?" Webb's voice carried clearly through the mess hall, causing nearby conversations to pause. Kids' table is probably somewhere off base where people who get scared of loud noises eat their dinner. Reeves looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for less than a second before returning her attention to her plate. "I'm fine here. Thank you." From across the room, Holloway's voice boomed out with practiced projection. "Hey Webb, ask our new medic if she needs help finding something she won't drop. Maybe they serve the food in unbreakable containers for people with shaky hands." The mess hall noise level decreased by half as soldiers turned toward the exchange. 200 pairs of eyes tracked between Webb standing over Reeves and Holloway grinning at his own joke. Laughter erupted from Holloway's table first, then rippled outward to other groups who'd heard the story about the dropped crate. Reeves set down her fork carefully and stood, her meal less than half finished. She picked up her tray without speaking and walked toward the disposal area. Her movements were economical and deliberate, her face flushed but her expression blank. Behind her, Webb called out another comment about scared rabbits running from wolves, which generated fresh laughter from the assembled soldiers. At a table near the eastern wall, Sergeant Rachel Kimura stopped eating entirely. She watched Reeves dispose of her food and exit through the south entrance, then watched Holloway's group celebrate their successful humiliation. Kimura's jaw worked silently, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She set it down and pushed her own tray away, her appetite gone. The next morning arrived with the kind of heat that made PT formation feel like punishment. Soldiers assembled at 0630 for equipment inspection, their uniforms already dark with sweat before the inspection began. Holloway moved through the ranks with his clipboard, checking weapons, gear, and supply inventories with mechanical efficiency. Reeves stood in formation with the other support personnel, her medical kit laid out for inspection according to regulation standards. Holloway paused when he reached her position, studying her equipment with exaggerated care. He picked up each item, examined it, then set it down harder than necessary. "Everything checks out," Holloway said, straightening. "But I've been thinking about your assignment. Medical Bay seems pretty quiet right now. Not much for you to do except stand around looking nervous. How about we put you somewhere more useful?" Reeves kept her eyes forward. "Whatever you think best, sir." "Good attitude. We need ammunition inventory completed today. The depot is just across the compound." You can count bullets without dropping them, right? Holloway's question drew chuckles from nearby soldiers who'd heard about the previous day's incident. Yes, sir, Reeves said quietly. Outstanding. Report to the ammunition depot at 0700. Santos will show you what needs counting. Holloway moved on to the next soldier without waiting for acknowledgement. Lieutenant Santos approached Reeves after formation dismissed. He led her across the compound toward a series of concrete bunkers on the eastern perimeter. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, and the temperature climbed toward triple digits. Other soldiers moved through their assignments in shaded areas or climate-controlled buildings. The ammunition depot sat completely exposed, its metal roof radiating heat like a griddle. Santos showed her the inventory sheets and explained the counting system with professional efficiency. When he finished, he gestured toward the rows of ammunition crates stacked 8 feet high. Everything needs verification by 1400 hours. Water station is at the north entrance. Stay hydrated. He left without additional commentary, and Reeves was alone with 10,000 rounds of various calibers that needed individual verification against manifest records. She began with the nearest stack, opening crates and counting in the steadily building heat. Within 30 minutes, her uniform was soaked through. Within an hour, her hands trembled slightly from the repetitive motion of lifting, counting, recording. Other soldiers moved through the depot periodically on their own tasks, always working in shaded areas or completing quick assignments before retreating to cooler locations. None of them spoke to Reeves. Some watched her work with expressions ranging from sympathy to satisfaction, but no one offered assistance or questions about her obvious struggle with the conditions. At 1200 hours, Sergeant Kimura appeared at the depot entrance carrying 2 bottles of water. She crossed directly to where Reeves worked through yet another crate of ammunition, the metal smell of gun oil mixing with dust and heat. Kimura held out the water without preamble. You don't have to take this, Kimura said as Reeves accepted the bottles and drank deeply from the first. There are channels, ways to report inappropriate duty assignments. Reeves finished half the bottle before responding. I appreciate the water, Sergeant, but I'm fine. I need to complete my assignment. He's punishing you for something that wasn't your fault. Everyone saw what happened with that crate. It was barely a fumble. Kimura's voice carried an edge of frustration, though she kept her volume low enough that no passing soldiers could overhear. I understand your concern, Reeves said, her tone gentle but final. I'm here to do my job. That's what I'm doing. Kimura studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to press the issue, but recognizing the futility. She nodded slowly and turned to leave, pausing at the depot entrance to look back. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. Reeves returned to her counting as Kimura disappeared into the afternoon heat shimmer. Her hands moved through the mechanical process of verification while her mind calculated entirely different numbers. Hours until nightfall. Minutes required to access the communications equipment in the medical bay. Variables in Holloway's patrol schedule that might create access windows. In the command center, Major Denning reviewed surveillance footage from the mess hall incident and the morning equipment inspection. She marked specific timestamps where Holloway's behavior crossed from dismissive into deliberately punitive. Then she opened her encrypted communication system and composed a message to Special Operations Command. Package maintaining cover under increasing pressure. Local command escalating harassment to include punitive duty assignments. Request guidance on intervention threshold. The response arrived within minutes. Continue observation. Mission window requires package mobility at 24-hour notice. Document all incidents. Intervention authorized if mission capability compromised. Denning closed the message and added new entries to her personal log. She included precise details about the ammunition depot assignment, the temperature readings from external sensors, and the estimated duration Reeves would be exposed to the conditions. She saved everything with careful timestamps that would establish a clear pattern if higher command required it later. At 1400 hours, Reeves completed the inventory and submitted her documentation to Santos. Her face was sunburned despite the covered areas she'd found during brief respites. Her hands shook slightly from dehydration despite the water Kimura had provided. But her inventory sheets were perfect, every count verified and double-checked according to protocol. Santos reviewed her work without expression. This is good. Captain will want to see it. He walked her back across the compound to the command building where Holloway reviewed daily reports. Holloway took the inventory sheets and scanned them quickly. Well done. See what you can accomplish when you focus instead of getting nervous about every little thing? Maybe tomorrow we'll find something else useful for you to do while medical bay stays quiet. Reeves nodded acknowledgement and waited to be dismissed. Holloway waved her away without further comment, already moving to his next task. She walked back to her assigned quarters slowly, her steps careful and measured despite her exhaustion. That evening, Sergeant Kimura sought out Major Denning in the command center. She requested a private conversation and followed Denning to a small office away from other personnel. Once the door closed, Kimura spoke quickly and directly. Captain Holloway is targeting that medic, Adrian Reeves. The ammunition depot assignment today was pure punishment for an incident that wasn't her fault. She was out there 7 hours in this heat, ma'am. No one else got assigned to exposed areas like that. Denning listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her attention complete. When Kimura finished, Denning asked a single question. Did she complete the assignment? Yes, ma'am. Perfectly. Every count verified. But that's not the point. The point is he's singling her out for harsh treatment based on his perception that she's weak or scared or doesn't belong here. I understand your concern, Sergeant. Denning's tone was measured and careful. I'll make note of it. Continue your duties and let me know if the situation changes. Kimura left frustrated, but without options to escalate further. Denning waited until she was alone, then added Kimura's report to the growing documentation file. She attached it to her next encrypted message to Special Operations Command with a simple addendum. Local personnel beginning to notice pattern. Situation approaching critical threshold. The response came faster this time. Acknowledged. Continue documentation. Be prepared to implement extraction protocol on 12-hour notice. Denning closed the message and returned to routine duties, her mind calculating timelines and scenarios. She'd seen Adrian Reeves endure far worse than this during their previous service together. But she'd also seen situations escalate from manageable to catastrophic in the span of hours. She pulled up the base duty roster and began memorizing who would be on watch when extraction became necessary. Because it wasn't a question of if anymore. It was only a question of when. The medical bay stood empty at 0300 hours, its fluorescent lights humming softly in the darkness. Adrian Reeves entered through the side door using credentials that identified her as authorized medical personnel with 24-hour access. She moved through the supply area without turning on additional lights, her steps silent on the tile floor. The communications terminal occupied a corner desk in the medical administrative office, ostensibly for coordinating patient transfers and supply requests. Reeves sat down and pulled a small device from her cargo pocket, no larger than a USB drive, but considerably more sophisticated. She connected it to the terminal's auxiliary port and began typing commands that had nothing to do with medical logistics. The screen filled with encrypted data streams as her device established connections through military satellite networks. She was building a communication relay that would support Operation Sandviper, a 12-operator rescue mission scheduled to launch in 21 hours from a location 300 kilometers northeast. The operators needed a secure backup channel in case their primary communications were compromised during extraction. Reeves was establishing that channel, routing it through 7 different military networks to create an untraceable path back to command. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, entering authorization codes and network protocols she'd memorized during her mission briefing. The relay construction required 40 minutes of uninterrupted access to military-grade communications equipment. She'd completed 18 minutes when the medical bay's main door opened with a metallic click that echoed through the silent space. Captain Holloway stepped inside, flashlight in hand, his expression already hardening into suspicion. He'd been conducting random security inspections throughout the night, a routine he implemented twice weekly to catch soldiers violating curfew or accessing restricted areas. Finding the medical bay occupied at this hour violated both expectations and regulations. What are you doing here, Reeves? His voice cut through the darkness as he approached the administrative office. The flashlight beam swept across her position at the communications terminal. Reeves's hands moved with controlled speed, closing the active windows on the screen while keeping her device connected. Sir, I couldn't sleep. I was checking the supply inventory database to verify tomorrow's delivery schedule. Holloway entered the office and positioned himself directly behind her chair, close enough that his presence felt deliberately invasive. At 0300, you're checking supply schedules in the middle of the night. I have trouble sleeping in new environments, sir. The deployment adjustment. Her voice carried the tremor he'd come to expect from her, the nervous uncertainty that reinforced his assumptions about her capability. He leaned closer, examining the terminal screen over her shoulder. That doesn't look like the supply database to me. What system are you actually accessing? Reeves began explaining something about networked inventory systems and cross-referencing delivery manifests, her words tumbling over each other with nervous speed. Holloway's suspicion deepened with each stammered phrase. He'd seen enough unauthorized access attempts during his career to recognize deception wrapped in technical jargon. Step away from that terminal, he ordered. Now. Reeves stood slowly, her hands raised slightly in a placating gesture. Sir, I'm authorized to access medical administrative systems. My credentials are verified for 24-hour use. Holloway grabbed her right arm above the elbow, his fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform hard enough to compress muscle against bone. His face was inches from hers when he spoke again. I don't care what your credentials say. You're not authorized to use communications equipment in the middle of the night without notifying the duty officer. That's suspicious behavior, and I'm not letting you walk away from it. He pulled her toward the office door, maintaining his grip as she stumbled slightly at the sudden movement. Reeves made no attempt to break free or resist, instead focusing on keeping her balance as Holloway dragged her through the medical bay toward the main exit. Her device remained connected to the terminal, still running its relay construction protocols, but accessing it now was impossible. From Guard Post 7, Sergeant Kimura watched the medical bay door open and Captain Holloway emerge with a tight grip on Reeves's arm. Even at 50 meters distance, the body language was unmistakable. Kimura lifted her radio immediately and switched to Major Denning's private channel. Ma'am, this is Kimura at Post 7. Captain Holloway just pulled the medic out of the medical bay. He's got his hands on her. Situation escalating. Denning's response came within seconds, her voice clear despite the early hours suggesting she'd been awake. Understood. Continue observation and report any changes. Do not intervene unless physical safety becomes immediate concern. Kimura watched Holloway march Reeves across the compound toward the command building, his grip never loosening. Her steps hurried to keep pace with his longer stride. She documented the time and direction in her duty log, then returned her attention to the perimeter, though her focus remained split. Holloway's office smelled like stale coffee and paper dust. He pushed Reeves into the chair across from his desk with enough force that it rolled backwards several inches before stopping against the wall. He remained standing, positioning himself between her and the door, his arms crossed, and his expression radiating controlled anger. You want to explain to me what you were really doing with that communications terminal? And don't give me another story about inventory databases. I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's lying to my face. Reeves sat with her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders hunched forward in the posture Holloway had come to associate with her weakness. I told you, sir. I was checking supply schedules. I have authorization to access those systems. At 0300 hours? Without notifying anyone. Using equipment that's monitored for security purposes? Holloway's voice rose with each question, his frustration building at her continued adherence to an obviously false story. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't recognize suspicious behavior when it's happening right in front of me? He continued for another 18 minutes, cycling through accusations about unauthorized access, security violations, and the general incompetence of support personnel who thought regulations didn't apply to them. Reeves absorbed the tirade in silence, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Holloway's left shoulder, her expression blank except for the flush creeping up her neck. Inside her mind, entirely separate from Holloway's escalating anger, Reeves ran calculations with mechanical precision. The relay construction required 40 minutes total. She'd completed 18 before interruption. Her device would continue working for another 12 minutes before automatic shutdown protocols engaged. That left 10 minutes of construction incomplete. The relay wouldn't be functional. Operation Sandviper launched in 20 hours and 16 minutes. The operators needed that backup channel established at least 6 hours before launch to verify functionality. Mission timeline compromised. Backup options limited. Extraction protocols possibly necessary. Holloway finally wound down his verbal assault and reached for his desk phone. He dialed Lieutenant Santos's quarters and waited through 4 rings before the younger officer answered with sleep-thick confusion. "Santos, I need you in my office immediately. We have a security situation." Holloway hung up without waiting for acknowledgement. 3 minutes later, Santos arrived wearing hastily assembled uniform pieces, his boots unlaced and his eyes still adjusting to wakefulness. Holloway briefed him with clipped efficiency about finding Reeves at the communications terminal, her suspicious behavior, and her inadequate explanations. "I want her confined to quarters until we can conduct a proper investigation. You're her escort. Make sure she stays there. No communications access, no wandering around base, no contact with other personnel without authorization. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Santos said, though his expression suggested questions he wouldn't voice in front of a superior officer. Holloway turned back to Reeves, who'd remained motionless in her chair throughout the entire exchange. "You're confined to quarters effective immediately pending investigation into unauthorized equipment access and suspicious behavior. Lieutenant Santos will escort you and ensure you comply with this order. When I have time tomorrow, we'll have a much longer conversation about what you were actually doing in that medical bay." Reeves stood slowly and followed Santos toward the door. Holloway watched them leave, his jaw still tight with anger, his mind already composing the report he'd file about support personnel security violations. Santos walked Reeves across the darkened compound without speaking until they were halfway to the temporary quarters assigned to transient medical staff. Then he broke the silence with a question that surprised both of them. "Were you actually doing something wrong in there?" Reeves looked at him briefly, her expression unreadable in the scattered light from perimeter lamps. "I was doing my job, Lieutenant. That's all." He nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer because pressing further would require him to question his captain's judgment. They reached the quarters and Santos waited while Reeves entered, then positioned himself outside the door with the uncomfortable awareness that he was essentially guarding a prisoner. Inside, Reeves sat on her bunk and retrieved her encrypted phone from a concealed pocket in her vest. She composed a message with economical precision. "Mission compromise. Relay construction incomplete. Timeline critical. Request immediate guidance." In the command center, Major Denning received 3 notifications simultaneously. Kimura's incident report about the physical grab, Reeves's encrypted distress signal about mission compromise, and an automated alert that someone had accessed the medical bay communications terminal at an unusual hour using legitimate credentials. Denning made her call to Joint Special Operations Command without hesitation, her words chosen for maximum clarity and minimum ambiguity. "This is Major Patricia Denning, FOB Kandahar. Package is compromised. Mission timeline at risk. Local command has confined package to quarters. Requesting immediate extraction authorization." The duty officer transferred her to Colonel Vincent Hartford within 30 seconds. Hartford had been monitoring Operation Sandviper preparations from JSOC headquarters, and Denning's call triggered immediate alarm protocols throughout the operations center. "Explain the situation, Major." Hartford's voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone making decisions that would affect lives measured in double digits. Denning provided a rapid briefing covering Reeves's cover identity, Holloway's escalating harassment pattern, the interrupted relay construction, and the current confinement that prevented mission completion. She spoke for 90 seconds without pause, delivering facts in order of tactical significance. Hartford pulled up Operation Sandviper's mission profile on his screen while she talked. 12 operators preparing for hostage rescue in Helmand Province. Primary communications through standard military channels. Backup relay through covert channel that Commander Reeves was establishing. Launch window in 20 hours. Without that backup relay, the operators would have no secure fallback if their primary communications were compromised by hostile forces. How much of the relay did she complete before interruption? Hartford asked. Approximately 45% according to her signal. She estimates 10 minutes of work remaining, but she's confined to quarters with no equipment access. Hartford made his decision with the certainty of someone who'd calculated risk against mission necessity thousands of times before. Authorize immediate extraction. Full reveal protocol. I want Commander Reeves extracted. I want that relay completed from a secure location, and I want everyone at FOB Kandahar to understand exactly what just happened. Understood, sir. Denning's fingers were already pulling up extraction team contact information on her secondary screen. Timeline for Black Hawk arrival. Their wheels up in 12 minutes. Arrival at your location in 43 minutes. Hartford paused before adding, and Major? Make sure Captain Holloway understands the magnitude of his mistake. That understanding needs to be very, very clear. It will be, sir. Denning closed the call and immediately opened secure channels to the extraction team staging at Bagram Airfield. She provided coordinates, security protocols, and explicit instructions that this was a command-level extraction requiring maximum visibility and minimum subtlety. Then she stood and walked to the window overlooking the compound. Somewhere in the darkness, Lieutenant Santos stood guard outside quarters containing a woman he thought was a nervous medic. Somewhere else, Captain Holloway slept soundly believing he'd caught a security violator. And in exactly 43 minutes, both of their assumptions would detonate like explosives buried beneath everything they thought they knew. Denning checked her watch and began counting down the minutes until a Black Hawk full of Special Forces operators arrived demanding access to the shy medic who couldn't handle being close to the action. The helicopter sound arrived first as a distant thump against the pre-dawn darkness, rhythmic and mechanical, coming from the northwest. Sergeant Kimura heard it from Guard Post 7 and immediately checked her duty roster. No scheduled flights for the next 6 hours. She lifted her radio to report the anomaly, but before she could speak, the sound intensified, growing from background noise to unmistakable presence. Inside the command center, Major Denning stood at the operations board tracking the incoming aircraft on radar. The Black Hawk was making no effort at stealth or discretion, flying a direct approach vector that would bring it straight to the main landing zone in 90 seconds. She picked up the base-wide announcement system and keyed the microphone with deliberate calm. All personnel, this is Major Denning. We have incoming aircraft on approach to landing zone Alpha. Clear the area immediately. This is a scheduled arrival. Repeat, this is scheduled. Clear landing zone Alpha. Across the compound, soldiers emerged from buildings and tents, drawn by the unusual announcement and the rapidly approaching rotor wash. Captain Holloway stepped out of his quarters still buttoning his uniform shirt, his expression irritated at being woken 40 minutes before his normal schedule. He'd been dreaming about the report he would write regarding Reeves's security violations. The Black Hawk descended fast, its approach pattern aggressive and non-standard. Most supply helicopters made gradual descents with wide circles. This one dropped like a stone toward the cleared landing zone, flaring at the last moment in a maneuver that suggested combat zone experience and urgency. The side doors were already open, revealing 4 figures in full tactical gear silhouetted against the aircraft's interior lighting. Lieutenant Santos stood outside the quarters where he'd been guarding Reeves for the past 37 minutes. The helicopter's arrival pulled his attention from the door, and he watched with growing confusion as the aircraft touched down with enough force to kick up a dust cloud that rolled across the compound. Special Forces operators didn't visit FOB Kandahar for routine business. They certainly didn't arrive in the middle of the night making aggressive landings. The first operator out was Captain Kyle Morrison, identifiable by his rank insignia and the command presence that made other soldiers instinctively create space around him. He moved toward the assembly of personnel gathering near the landing zone, with 3 other operators flanking him in a tactical formation that suggested they were ready for resistance. Morrison's voice carried over the dying rotor noise with parade ground clarity. I need Captain Holloway and whoever's in charge of this facility. Right now? Major Denning emerged from the command center and approached with measured steps. I'm Major Denning, Executive Officer. Captain Holloway is approaching from the north side. Holloway arrived at a near jog, his shirt still partially untucked, his confusion deepening into concern. I'm Captain Holloway. What's this about? We weren't notified of any Special Forces arrivals. Morrison turned to face him fully, and the intensity of his expression made Holloway take an involuntary half-step backward. Where is Commander Adrian Reeves? We have emergency extraction orders from Joint Special Operations Command. I need her location immediately. The compound activity ceased entirely. Soldiers who'd been moving toward morning duties froze in place. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye tracked to Holloway's face as the color drained from it in a progression visible even in the poor lighting. Commander? Holloway's voice came out strangled. There's no commander here by that name. We have a medic named Reeves. She's confined to quarters for security violations. Morrison's expression hardened into something dangerous. You can find a JSOC commander? His words dropped like weights, each syllable precisely articulated to ensure no misunderstanding was possible. Lieutenant Santos, standing 50 yards away outside the quarters, felt his stomach drop through his boots. The shy medic he'd been guarding. The woman who dropped supply crates and stammered through conversations. The person Captain Holloway had been mocking for 3 days. A JSOC commander. Holloway's mouth opened and closed twice before words emerged. That's impossible. She's support personnel. Medical staff. She presented credentials identifying her as a medic. Commander Adrian Reeves, Special Forces Group 3, JSOC Liaison to 5th Fleet Operations. Morrison recited the information with the weight of absolute certainty. She's been conducting classified work at this facility under operational cover. Where is she, Captain? Major Denning stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. She's in the transient quarters, Building 7, currently under guard by Lieutenant Santos per Captain Holloway's orders from earlier this morning. Morrison gestured to his 3 operators and began moving toward Building 7 without waiting for additional discussion. Holloway followed in a daze, his command presence evaporating with each step. Behind them, the compound erupted into urgent whispers as soldiers processed what they'd just witnessed. Santos straightened to attention as the Special Forces team approached, his hand automatically moving to his sidearm before he consciously registered the futility of such a gesture. Morrison stopped directly in front of him with the 3 other operators forming a loose perimeter. Open that door, Lieutenant. Santos fumbled with the lock mechanism, his hands shaking enough that it took 2 attempts. The door swung inward, revealing the small quarters, Spartan and functional. Adrian Reeves sat on the edge of the bunk where she'd been waiting with perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. Morrison entered first, and the change in Reeves was immediate and total. She stood in a single fluid motion, her shoulders back, her chin level, her entire bearing transformed from hunched uncertainty to command authority. The shy medic had vanished completely, replaced by someone whose presence filled the small space with undeniable power. Commander Reeves. Morrison's tone shifted to professional respect. We have extraction orders. What's your status on Operation Sandviper? Relay construction interrupted at 45% completion. Reeves's voice was different too, clear and precise without any trace of the tremor that had defined her previous speech. Timeline compromised. Launch window in 19 hours. I need secure equipment access to complete the relay, or the operators are going in with no backup communications. Holloway stood in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. Lieutenant Santos pressed himself against the wall beside him, trying to become invisible while simultaneously unable to look away from the transformation occurring in front of them. Morrison pulled a satellite phone from his tactical vest and handed it to Reeves. Colonel Hartford is standing by for your direct report. Reeves took the phone and stepped into the corner, speaking in low tones that carried authority even when words weren't audible. She discussed mission parameters, timeline calculations, and backup protocols with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted thousands of similar briefings. After 90 seconds, she handed the phone back to Morrison. Colonel Hartford confirms backup relay can be established from Bagram. He wants me extracted immediately for mission briefing and completion. Reeves turned to face Holloway directly for the first time since the revelation, and her gaze was surgical in its precision. Captain, you physically restrained a JSOC officer conducting classified operations. You confined me to quarters, preventing completion of mission-critical communications infrastructure. You interfered with work that affects 12 operators currently preparing for hostile environment extraction. Holloway's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. You presented as medical personnel. How was I supposed to know? That's exactly correct, Captain. You didn't know? Reeves's tone carried no anger, just factual assessment that somehow felt more devastating than rage. You made assumptions based on my cover behavior. You assigned punitive duties because you perceived weakness. You physically grabbed me and confined me without verifying my actual role or authority. Major Denning will brief you on next steps regarding this incident. She walked past Holloway without another glance, moving with the controlled purpose of someone who'd already dismissed him from consideration. Morrison and the three other operators fell in around her in a protective formation as they headed toward the waiting Black Hawk. Behind them, Holloway stood motionless in the quarter's doorway, his career visibly crumbling in real time across his expression. The walk to the landing zone drew every eye on base. Soldiers lined the pathways and emerged from buildings to watch Commander Reeves move through the compound with her Special Forces escort. Her transformation from the shy woman they'd seen dropping crates and accepting harassment was so complete that several soldiers questioned whether this was even the same person. At the landing zone, Morrison gestured Reeves toward the Black Hawk first. She climbed in with athletic ease, settling into the crew seat and accepting the headset handed to her by one of the operators. The 4 Special Forces personnel boarded in sequence, their movements coordinated and efficient. Major Denning approached the aircraft's open door and leaned in close enough to be heard over the spinning rotors. "Commander, I apologize for the compromise. The cover held, but the situation deteriorated faster than anticipated." Reeves shook her head slightly. "You did everything correctly, Major. You documented the harassment pattern and reported when intervention became necessary. This outcome isn't on you." The Black Hawk lifted off with the same aggressive ascent it had used during arrival, climbing rapidly and banking northwest toward Bagram Airfield. The rotor wash scattered loose equipment and debris across the landing zone, but no one moved to secure anything. Every soldier stood watching the helicopter disappear into the lightning sky, their minds struggling to reconcile 3 days of assumptions with 30 minutes of reality. Captain Holloway remained near Building 7, his position unchanged from where he'd watched Reeves walk away. Lieutenant Santos approached cautiously, his own face pale with the recognition of his complicity in the disaster. "Sir," Santos began, but Holloway cut him off with a gesture. "Don't. Just don't." Holloway's voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd watched his future collapse. "We grabbed a JSOC commander. We harassed her. We interfered with her mission. There's no fixing this." Across the compound, Sergeant Kimura stood with a cluster of other soldiers near the mess hall, their conversation urgent and disbelieving. "Did you see her face when she transformed? That wasn't the same person we've been watching all week. That was someone completely different. That was who she actually is," another soldier responded. "Everything else was an act. The shy behavior, the nervousness, all of it. She was undercover the whole time. And we watched Captain Holloway treat her like she was incompetent," Kimura said quietly. "We watched him mock her and assign her punishment details. And she just took it because that's what her mission required." The sunrise illuminated FOB Kandahar in shades of orange and gold, but the beauty was lost on personnel who'd just witnessed their commanding officer destroy his career through assumption and arrogance. Work details assembled with subdued efficiency, conversations held in hushed tones, every soldier processing the revelation through their own lens of guilt or vindication. In the command center, Major Denning compiled her final report on the incident. She included every piece of documentation she'd gathered over the past 3 days, every surveillance clip, every witness statement, every encrypted communication with JSOC. The pattern was clear and damning. Captain Derek Holloway had created a hostile environment through systematic harassment of someone he perceived as weak, and when that harassment interfered with critical military operations, the institutional response was immediate and absolute. She encrypted the report and transmitted it to 5th Fleet headquarters with a priority flag that would ensure it reached General Sullivan's desk within the hour. Then she began the secondary task of preparing FOB Kandahar for the investigation team that would inevitably follow. Lieutenant Santos sat in his quarters with his head in his hands, replaying the past 3 days through the new lens of understanding. He'd participated in the harassment. He'd laughed at the jokes. He'd stood guard to prevent a JSOC commander from completing mission-critical work. His complicity was documented and undeniable. Captain Holloway sat in his office, staring at the confinement order he'd written hours earlier. Confined to quarters pending investigation into unauthorized equipment access and suspicious behavior. He'd written those words believing he was protecting base security. Now they read like evidence of catastrophic judgment failure that had compromised 12 operators and possibly cost lives. The Black Hawk carrying Commander Reeves touched down at Bugram Airfield exactly 42 minutes after departing FOB Kandahar. She was met by a full operations team with secure communications equipment already configured for relay completion. Within 18 minutes of arrival, she'd finished the interrupted work and verified the backup channel's functionality with the operators preparing for Operation Sandviper. Colonel Hartford joined her in the communications bay after she completed the verification sequence. "Commander, your mission work here is excellent as always. The personal situation with Captain Holloway will be handled through appropriate channels." "Understood, sir." Reeves's tone suggested she'd already moved past the harassment to focus on the work ahead. "The operators have their backup relay. That's what matters." "That's what matters operationally," Hartford agreed. "But what happened at that FOB matters institutionally. Captain Holloway will face consequences for this. So will anyone in his chain of command who enabled the environment that allowed it." Reeves nodded acknowledgement, but offered no additional comment. She'd endured 3 days of harassment as part of maintaining operational cover. The mission had succeeded despite interference. Everything else was someone else's problem to solve. At FOB Kandahar, the sun climbed higher, and soldiers moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency, their minds still processing the revelation that had shattered their morning. The shy medic who'd seemed so out of place had been a Special Forces commander the entire time. The weakness they perceived had been deliberate performance. And the man who'd mocked her most viciously was about to learn exactly how expensive assumptions could be. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Pacheco arrived at FOB Kandahar 48 hours after the Black Hawk extraction with a reputation for thoroughness that made junior officers nervous and senior officers careful. She worked for the Judge Advocate General Corps, investigating military incidents where legal accountability intersected with operational consequences. Her silver oak leaves caught the morning sun as she exited the transport helicopter carrying 2 cases of investigation equipment and a mandate from 5th Fleet Command to document everything. Major Denning met her at the landing zone with a tablet containing 3 days of compiled evidence. Before they reached the command center, Pacheco had already reviewed the timeline of events from Reeves's arrival through her emergency extraction. Her expression revealed nothing, but her questions were precise and probing. They settled in a conference room configured for privacy, and Denning provided context that surveillance footage couldn't capture. Commander Reeves was conducting classified JSOC operations under deep cover. Her behavioral profile was deliberately constructed to appear inexperienced and uncertain. Captain Holloway's response to that profile escalated from dismissive comments to punitive duty assignments to physical restraint. Pacheco made notes on her tablet with rapid stylus movements. "You observed this escalation in real time. Why didn't you intervene earlier?" Denning had anticipated the question and answered without defensiveness. "Intervention would have compromised Commander Reeves's cover and potentially the mission she was conducting. My orders from JSOC were to observe, document, and report unless mission capability became compromised. When Captain Holloway confined her to quarters and prevented equipment access, that threshold was crossed. Show me the surveillance footage." Pacheco spent the next 90 minutes reviewing every recorded interaction between Holloway and Reeves. The mess hall harassment, the ammunition depot assignment, the physical grab outside the medical bay. Each incident was time-stamped and archived with meticulous precision. When the review finished, Pacheco set down her tablet and looked directly at Denning. "This is clear-cut harassment escalating to interference with military operations. But I need to understand if this is isolated behavior or part of a larger pattern. Has Captain Holloway demonstrated similar conduct with other personnel?" "Sergeant Rachel Kimura can answer that question better than I can." Denning pulled up Kimura's duty roster and arranged for her to report to the conference room within 20 minutes. Kimura arrived in full uniform, her posture rigid with the awareness that her testimony would affect careers and possibly freedom. Pacheco gestured for her to sit and began with foundation questions about her service record and time at FOB Kandahar, before moving to the relevant incidents. Sergeant, did you witness Captain Holloway's interactions with Commander Reeves during her time here? Yes, ma'am. I saw the mess hall incident where he mocked her in front of 200 personnel. I witnessed the ammunition depot assignment where she worked 7 hours in exposed heat. I observed him physically grab her arm and pull her across the compound. Kimura's voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Did you attempt to intervene or report these incidents? I provided water to Commander Reeves during the depot assignment and told her she didn't have to accept the treatment. She declined my assistance. I also reported the physical grab to Major Dinning immediately after witnessing it. Pacheco made another note before asking the question that would expand the investigation scope. Has Captain Holloway demonstrated similar behavior toward other support personnel during your time here? Kimura's expression tightened. Yes, ma'am. Over the past year, I've watched 3 medics and 2 supply officers rotate out early from this posting. They all cited hostile command environment in their departure paperwork. Captain Holloway has a pattern of targeting people he perceives as weak or unsuited for deployment. Do you know if any of those personnel filed formal complaints? 2 of them did. Medical specialist Elena Martinez filed a complaint in March about Captain Holloway grabbing her shoulder and screaming about uniform standards in front of her entire unit. Supply Officer James Chun filed a complaint in July about being assigned outdoor labor in 100-degree heat for 3 consecutive days after questioning a requisition order. Kimura recited the information from memory, suggesting she'd reviewed it carefully before this interview. Pacheco's stylus moved rapidly across her tablet. What happened to those complaints? They were reviewed by Battalion Commander Colonel Richard Patterson. Both were marked as personality conflicts and closed with notations that counseling was provided. No formal action was taken against Captain Holloway. The interview continued for another 40 minutes as Pacheco extracted specific details about each incident Kimura had witnessed or heard reported. When she finally dismissed the sergeant, she had names, dates, and documented patterns that transformed an isolated incident into systemic behavior. Major Dinning returned to the conference room with personnel files Pacheco had requested. 5 folders, each representing someone who'd rotated from FOB Kandahar before completing their standard tour length. Pacheco spread them across the table and began cross-referencing departure dates with incident reports. Elena Martinez, medical specialist, departed 6 months early after filing harassment complaint. Complaint reviewed by Colonel Patterson, marked as resolved through counseling. Pacheco pulled up the actual complaint document and read Martinez's description of Holloway grabbing her shoulder hard enough to leave bruises while berating her about appearance standards. James Chun, supply officer, departed 4 months early after filing complaint about punitive duty assignments. Same review process, same resolution through counseling notation. 3 other personnel had departed early without filing formal complaints, but their exit interviews contained references to hostile leadership and difficulty working with command staff. The pattern was consistent and damning. Pacheco drafted a request for interviews with Martinez and Chun, both of whom had since been reassigned to stateside positions. While waiting for authorization to contact them, she moved to the next phase of investigation by requesting Lieutenant Marcus Webb's presence in the conference room. Webb arrived with visible apprehension, his usual confidence eroded by 3 days of watching his commanding officer's career disintegrate. Pacheco began with his role in the mess hall harassment, and Webb initially attempted to minimize his participation. I was following Captain Holloway's lead. Everyone knew he didn't respect support roles. He set the tone for how we interacted with those personnel. Lieutenant, you approached Commander Reeves's table and made comments about a kid's table and scared rabbits. That wasn't following anyone's lead. That was active participation in harassment. Pacheco's tone remained neutral, but her words carried weight. Webb's defense crumbled under direct examination. He admitted participating in the mockery, admitted finding humor in Reeves's apparent nervousness, admitted never questioning whether the treatment was appropriate. His testimony provided confirmation that Holloway's behavior wasn't isolated actions, but rather established command culture that subordinates felt empowered to replicate. Lieutenant Philip Santos was interviewed next, and his testimony proved even more damaging to Holloway's position. Santos described being ordered to guard Reeves after her confinement, being instructed to keep her away from communications equipment regardless of her explanations, and being told that support personnel needed to learn their place in the operational hierarchy. Did Captain Holloway explicitly tell you to prevent Commander Reeves from accessing communications equipment? Pacheco leaned forward slightly, recognizing the significance of Santos's answer. Yes, ma'am. He said to keep that medic away from communications equipment and not to care what excuse she gave. Those were his exact words approximately 4 hours before he found her in the medical bay. That testimony established premeditation. Holloway hadn't simply stumbled upon a security violation. He'd been primed to suspect Reeves specifically and had instructed his subordinates to restrict her access before the incident occurred. While Pacheco conducted interviews at FOB Kandahar, Commander Reeves sat in a debriefing room at Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters with Colonel Vincent Hartford reviewing the operational impact of the mission compromise. The room's walls displayed tactical maps of Helmand Province marked with operator positions and extraction routes. The relay interruption delayed our backup communications establishment by 4 hours and 17 minutes. Hartford pulled up the mission timeline on the main display screen. Operation Sandviper launched on schedule, but the operators were forced to use less secure primary channels for the first phase of extraction because your backup relay wasn't functional until 0620. Reeves studied the timeline with critical assessment. Did the delay compromise operator safety or mission success? The hostage extraction succeeded with all operators returning safely. However, signals intelligence suggests the insurgent cell detected unusual communication patterns approximately 90 minutes into the operation. They increased patrol activity in the extraction corridor, which forced our operators to use a secondary route that added 18 minutes to exfiltration time. Hartford expanded the tactical map to show the route changes. The secondary route passed within 400 meters of a known hostile position. If timing had been different by 10 minutes, we could have had operators making contact with a superior force in unfavorable terrain. The implication was clear. Holloway's interference had come within minutes of costing lives. Reeves absorbed the information with professional detachment, but her expression hardened slightly. She'd endured 3 days of harassment specifically to maintain cover for this mission. The idea that her forced extraction had nearly undermined that sacrifice carried weight beyond personal affront. Colonel, my formal statement will emphasize the operational necessity of the cover identity and the direct causation between Captain Holloway's actions and mission timeline compromise. Hartford nodded acknowledgement as Reeves continued. 12 operators were placed at increased risk because he physically restrained me and prevented equipment access. That's not a personality conflict or a cultural misunderstanding. That's interference with critical military operations. Hartford saved her statement and added it to the investigation file that would be forwarded to Lieutenant Commander Pacheco. Your professionalism throughout this incident has been exemplary, Commander. The fact that you maintained cover despite escalating harassment speaks to your training and discipline. Reeves accepted the commendation with a slight nod, but redirected the conversation back to operational matters. The relay is now functioning at full capacity. All backup protocols are verified. Operation Sandviper communication security is no longer dependent on compromised infrastructure. She left the debriefing room and returned to duty rotation, her focus already shifting to the next mission assignment. The investigation into Holloway's conduct was someone else's responsibility. Her responsibility was ensuring operators had the support they needed to complete dangerous work in hostile environments. Back at FOB Kandahar, Lieutenant Commander Pacheco completed her final interviews and began compiling her investigation report. She worked through the night, organizing testimony, cross-referencing incidents, and building a timeline that revealed systemic failure across multiple levels of command. Her report opened with executive summary that laid out the findings in unambiguous language. Captain Derek Holloway engaged in a documented pattern of harassment spanning 14 months affecting at least 5 separate individuals. The behavior escalated from verbal mockery to punitive duty assignments to physical restraint. 2 formal complaints were filed by affected personnel in March and July. Both complaints were reviewed by Battalion Commander Colonel Richard Patterson and closed without substantive action. The report detailed each incident with supporting documentation. Elena Martinez's bruised shoulder from Holloway's grip while being berated about uniform standards. James Chin's 3-day assignment to outdoor labor in extreme heat after questioning a supply order. 3 additional personnel who rotated out early citing hostile environment. And finally, Commander Adrian Reeves, subjected to escalating harassment that culminated in physical restraint and confinement that directly interfered with classified JSOC operations. Pacheco's analysis section examined the institutional failures that enabled the pattern. Colonel Patterson's reviews of the Martinez and Chun complaints were perfunctory and dismissive. Both were characterized as personality conflicts despite clear evidence of inappropriate conduct. The counseling provided to Holloway consisted of verbal reminders about professional standards without formal documentation or follow-up verification. The operational impact section drew directly from Colonel Hartford's debriefing of Commander Reeves. Mission timeline compromised by 4 hours and 17 minutes. Operators forced to use less secure primary communications. Secondary extraction route required due to detected communication patterns. Increased operator exposure to hostile forces with near-contact outcome. Pacheco's recommendations were stark and uncompromising. Court-martial proceedings for Captain Derek Holloway on charges of physical restraint of superior officer, interference with classified operations, creation of hostile environment, and failure to verify personnel credentials. Administrative review for Colonel Richard Patterson regarding improper handling of harassment complaints. Implementation of fleet-wide reforms to harassment reporting and investigation procedures. She encrypted the completed report and transmitted it directly to General Marcus Sullivan, 5th Fleet Commander, with priority classification that would ensure immediate review. Then she packed her investigation equipment and prepared for transport back to Fleet Headquarters where she would present her findings in person. The report reached General Sullivan's desk at 00:00 on a Thursday morning. He read it twice before calling his Chief of Staff and legal counsel to his office for immediate consultation. By 1000 hours, court-martial proceedings had been authorized and Colonel Patterson had been notified of pending administrative review. At FOB Kandahar, Captain Derek Holloway received formal notification of charges being filed against him. He sat in his office reading the document with hands that trembled slightly, each charge a hammer blow against the career he'd built over 15 years. Physical restraint of superior officer. Interference with classified JSOC operation. Pattern of harassment creating hostile environment. Failure to verify personnel credentials before confinement. Lieutenant Santos stood outside Holloway's office, his own notification of investigation pending. He'd participated in the harassment. He'd guarded Reeves during her confinement. He'd followed orders that had compromised military operations. His complicity was documented across 40 pages of investigation reports. Sergeant Kimura received commendation for her attempted intervention and her comprehensive testimony during the investigation. But the commendation felt hollow when measured against the knowledge that she'd watched harassment unfold for 3 days before it escalated to the point requiring external response. The investigation was complete. The pattern was documented. The institutional failures were exposed. All that remained was the delivery of consequences and the implementation of reforms meant to ensure such failures couldn't recur. General Sullivan scheduled the court-martial for 3 weeks hence, allowing time for all witnesses to be assembled and all evidence to be properly prepared. The proceedings would be formal, public, and comprehensive. The Fifth Fleet would watch one of its captains face judgment for letting assumptions and arrogance override professionalism and duty. The court-martial chamber at Fifth Fleet Headquarters was designed to convey the gravity of military justice. High ceilings, polished wood paneling, and the flags of all service branches created an atmosphere of institutional authority. 3 weeks after the investigation report reached General Marcus Sullivan's desk, Captain Derek Holloway stood before a panel of 5 officers whose combined experience spanned 87 years of military service. General Sullivan presided from the elevated bench, his silver stars catching the overhead lights as he reviewed the formal charges. The gallery held 40 witnesses, including Major Patricia Denning, Sergeant Rachel Kimura, Lieutenants Marcus Webb and Philip Santos, and a dozen other personnel from FOB Kandahar who'd witnessed various aspects of the incidents. The court recorder read charges in a voice trained for clarity and precision. Captain Derek Holloway is charged with Article 128, assault and battery, specifically physical restraint of a superior officer. Article 92, failure to obey order or regulation, specifically interference with classified Joint Special Operations Command activities. Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment, specifically creation of hostile environment through systematic harassment. Article 134, general article, specifically failure to verify personnel credentials and authority before implementing confinement. Holloway sat at the defense table in dress uniform, his decorations and service ribbons a visual record of 15 years that would be erased by the end of proceedings. His attorney, a Marine Corps captain named Marcus Tomlinson, had already advised him that the evidence was overwhelming and the best outcome involved minimizing sentencing rather than contesting guilt. The prosecution called Commander Adrian Reeves as its first witness. She entered through the rear doors wearing full Special Forces dress uniform, her combat decorations prominently displayed across her chest. 3 bronze stars with Valor device. 2 Purple Hearts. The Special Forces tab above her unit insignia. The quiet medic who'd seemed overwhelmed by deployment had been replaced entirely by someone whose presence commanded immediate attention. Reeves was sworn in and took the witness stand with military bearing that made several gallery members sit straighter in their seats. The prosecutor, a Navy commander named Elizabeth Chun, began with foundation questions about Reeves's service record and qualifications before moving to the mission specifics. Commander Reeves, please describe the classified operation you were conducting at FOB Kandahar during the relevant time period. Reeves addressed her answer to the panel rather than the prosecutor. I was establishing a covert communications relay to support Operation Sandviper, a 12-operator hostage rescue mission in Helmand Province. The relay provided backup communications channel in case primary systems were compromised by hostile forces. My cover identity was medical support personnel to explain my presence at the forward operating base. Why was the cover identity necessary? The relay construction required accessing military communications infrastructure in ways that would appear suspicious if conducted openly. The cover identity allowed me to work without drawing attention from base personnel or potential hostile intelligence gathering. Commander Chin walked Reeves through each incident, starting with the initial dismissive comments and progressing through the mess hall harassment, the ammunition depot assignment, and finally the physical restraint outside the medical bay. Reeves described each event with factual precision, her tone devoid of emotion, but her words painting a clear picture of escalating misconduct. When Captain Holloway grabbed your arm and pulled you toward his office, what was your immediate concern? Mission timeline. Reeves's answer was immediate and definitive. I had 18 minutes of work remaining to complete the relay construction. Launch window for Operation Sandviper was 19 hours away. The relay needed minimum 6 hours verification before operators deployed. Captain Holloway's confinement made completion impossible within the required timeline. What was the operational consequence of that impossibility? Commander Chen displayed the tactical maps and mission timeline that Colonel Hartford had compiled. Reeves explained how the 4-hour delay forced operators to use less secure primary communications, how signals intelligence detected unusual patterns, how the extraction route had to be modified, and how operators came within 400 meters of hostile forces due to the route change. The gallery was silent as she concluded her testimony. In your professional assessment, Commander, what risk did Captain Holloway's actions create for the 12 operators conducting Operation Sandviper? Measurable increased risk of casualty or capture. The secondary extraction route passed through terrain with limited cover and known hostile presence. Timing variance of 10 minutes in either direction could have resulted in direct contact with superior enemy forces. Defense Attorney Tomlinson attempted cross-examination focused on whether Holloway could reasonably have known Reeves's true identity. Sullivan interrupted before the line of questioning could develop. Counsel, the question of identity verification is irrelevant to the harassment charges. Even if Commander Reeves had been the medical specialist she appeared to be, Captain Holloway's conduct would constitute inappropriate treatment of military personnel. The identity revelation only adds the operational interference charges. Do not waste this court's time suggesting that ignorance of someone's rank excuses systemic harassment. Tomlinson sat down without further questions, and Reeves was dismissed. She returned to the gallery and took a seat in the front row where her presence would be unavoidable to Holloway's peripheral vision throughout the remaining proceedings. Sergeant Kimura testified next about witnessing the escalation and her attempts to intervene. She described Reeves working 7 hours in exposed heat, the physical grab she'd reported immediately to Major Denning, and her observations about Holloway's pattern of targeting support personnel he perceived as weak. Major Denning provided testimony about her surveillance and documentation efforts, explaining the operational necessity of non-intervention until mission capability became compromised. She submitted encrypted communications with JSOC showing real-time reporting of Holloway's behavior and the eventual authorization for emergency extraction. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Pacheco took the stand to present the investigation findings in comprehensive detail. She walked the panel through 14 months of documented pattern affecting 5 separate personnel. She explained Colonel Patterson's inadequate response to previous complaints. She demonstrated how Holloway's behavior had created systemic hostile environment that multiple people had attempted to escape through early rotation. The prosecution rested after 6 hours of testimony. Defense counsel Tomlinson called no witnesses, instead presenting a brief closing argument that acknowledged Holloway's misconduct while emphasizing his 15 years of service and requesting leniency in sentencing. The panel retired to deliberate at 1600 hours. 47 minutes later, they returned with verdict and sentencing recommendation. General Sullivan read the findings with formal gravity that left no room for misinterpretation. On the charge of assault and battery, this court finds the accused guilty. On the charge of failure to obey order or regulation, this court finds the accused guilty. On the charge of cruelty and maltreatment, this court finds the accused guilty. On the charge under the general article, this court finds the accused guilty. Holloway's face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the table edge with enough force to blanch his knuckles white. Sullivan continued without pause. This court sentences Captain Derek Holloway to dishonorable discharge from the United States Navy, reduction in rank to Seaman Recruit E1, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 6 months. These sentences will be executed immediately following these proceedings. 2 military police personnel approached the defense table. Holloway stood slowly and allowed them to escort him from the chamber. He passed within 3 feet of Commander Reeves without looking in her direction. The doors closed behind him with mechanical finality. General Sullivan dismissed the court but requested that Commander Reeves, Major Denning, and Sergeant Kimura remain for brief consultation. When the gallery had cleared, he addressed them directly. The 3 of you represent different aspects of professionalism under pressure. Commander Reeves, you maintained operational security despite escalating harassment. Major Denning, you documented misconduct while respecting mission parameters. Sergeant Kimura, you attempted intervention within the constraints of your position. This court recognizes that each of you performed duties under difficult circumstances. He pulled a document from his folder and set it on the bench. I'm also addressing the institutional failures that enabled this situation to develop. Colonel Richard Patterson's administrative review concluded this morning. He received formal reprimand for improper handling of harassment complaints, mandatory training on investigation protocols, and notation in his permanent record that will affect promotion consideration. Sullivan picked up a different document, this one marked with official letterhead and multiple signatures. More significantly, I'm issuing fleet-wide directive effective immediately. All commands will implement revised harassment complaint procedures with independent reporting channels that bypass immediate chain of command. Support personnel credentials will be verified before any disciplinary action. Harassment prevention training becomes quarterly requirement. Anonymous reporting system with Judge Advocate General oversight will be established across all facilities. The reforms were comprehensive and permanent, changes that would affect thousands of personnel across dozens of installations. Sullivan continued with specific implementation timelines and enforcement mechanisms before concluding the consultation. These failures end here. This behavior ends here. You're dismissed. 6 days after the court-martial, Major Patricia Denning received notification of promotion to lieutenant colonel and assumption of command at FOB Kandahar. She arrived back at the base with new rank insignia and clear mandate from General Sullivan to implement cultural reforms immediately. She assembled all personnel on the main parade ground for formal change of command ceremony. 250 soldiers stood in formation under cloudless sky, while Denning addressed them from the elevated platform normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. Some of you witnessed events 3 weeks ago that resulted in court-martial proceedings and command changes. Some of you participated in those events either actively or through silence. All of you are responsible for ensuring nothing similar happens again at this facility. Denning's voice carried across the formation with clarity born from years of command experience. Commander Adrienne Reeves maintained mission security despite hostile environment because that's what her duty required. She endured harassment, accepted punitive assignments, and absorbed mockery without breaking cover because 12 operators depended on her professionalism. That's the standard for how soldiers conduct themselves under pressure. That's the example you will follow. She outlined the new harassment reporting procedures, the verification requirements, and the training schedules that would begin immediately. Then she made personal commitment that signaled the cultural shift. Every member of this command, regardless of role or apparent rank, will be treated with respect and professionalism. Support personnel enable combat operations. Medical staff save lives. Supply officers ensure mission readiness. Anyone who doesn't understand that fundamental truth can request transfer immediately because they have no place in this command. The formation was dismissed, and soldiers dispersed to their duties with the awareness that assumptions about weakness or unsuitability would no longer be tolerated or enabled. Sergeant Kimura reported to Lieutenant Colonel Denning's office that afternoon and received assignment as the base's first harassment response coordinator, a new position created specifically to ensure reporting channels remained functional and accessible. 6 months passed with remarkable speed. Operation Sandviper became classified history, its success attributed to precise planning and professional execution. The operators who'd benefited from Commander Reeves's backup communications relay never knew how close the mission had come to compromise. Captain Derek Holloway completed his confinement sentence and departed military service with dishonorable discharge that would follow him into civilian life. Commander Adrienne Reeves stood at the front of a classroom at Special Forces Qualification School addressing 40 candidates in Week 7 of the most demanding training program in military service. Her presentation topic was maintaining cover in hostile environments, and she used her own experience as primary teaching example. Effective cover requires absolute commitment to the constructed identity. Every behavior, every reaction, every word must align with what that identity would naturally display. She displayed surveillance footage from FOB Kandahar, showing her dropping the supply crate, hunching her shoulders in the mess hall, and working silently through the ammunition inventory. This is what successful cover looks like. Uncomfortable, vulnerable, authentic enough that people make assumptions without questioning them. She advanced to footage of the Black Hawk arrival and her transformation. And this is what happens when cover is no longer necessary. The shift must be immediate and complete. There's no gradual transition. You're either fully committed to the cover or you've dropped it entirely. The candidates watched with intense focus as she walked them through decision points where she'd chosen mission security over personal dignity. The mockery in the mess hall. The punitive labor assignment. The physical restraint that had ultimately compromised her timeline. Each incident became teaching moment about prioritizing mission over ego. One candidate raised his hand with a question Reeves had anticipated. "Ma'am, at what point should someone break cover to prevent mission failure?" Never break cover to prevent something. Only break cover when mission success requires it or higher command authorizes extraction. I endured harassment for 3 days because maintaining cover was the mission. When that harassment prevented mission completion, extraction was authorized by Joint Special Operations Command. I didn't make that decision. Command made it based on operational necessity. She dismissed the class with final reminder that cover work demanded sacrifice most people never saw or acknowledged. The candidates filed out discussing the presentation, several of them reassessing their assumptions about what special operations actually required. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of how they appeared or acted? Have you ever been that person yourself, staying quiet while others made assumptions? Drop a comment and share your experience. These stories matter because they remind us that strength comes in many forms and judgment based on surface appearance is almost always wrong. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. At FOB Kandahar, a transport helicopter touched down on a Wednesday afternoon carrying routine supply delivery and 3 new personnel assignments. One of them was medical specialist Jennifer Hawthorne, fresh from advanced trauma training and nervous about her first deployment to an active theater. She climbed down from the helicopter clutching her orders and looking around the unfamiliar base with wide eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Denning met her at the landing zone personally, a practice she'd implemented for all new arrivals. She shook Hawthorne's hand and introduced herself with genuine warmth that immediately eased the younger woman's visible tension. "Welcome to FOB Kandahar, Specialist. Your quarters are prepared, your duty assignments are ready for review, and my door is always open if you need anything. We run a professional command here where every role is valued and every person is respected. You're going to do excellent work." Hawthorne's relief was visible as she followed Denning toward the command building. Behind them, the supply crews began unloading crates with efficient teamwork. No one mocked the nervous new arrival. No one questioned her capability. No one assigned punitive duties based on perceived weakness. The culture had shifted not through speeches or policies alone, but through the example of a commander who'd endured harassment without breaking and an institution that had delivered consequences severe enough to ensure everyone understood the new standard. Assumptions about weakness were no longer acceptable. Mockery of uncertainty was no longer tolerated. Every person was given the respect their service deserved until their actions proved otherwise. 600 miles away, Commander Adrienne Reeves prepared for her next assignment, another mission requiring cover identity and absolute commitment to role. She would become someone else, somewhere else, enabling operations that other people would complete successfully without ever knowing her name. That anonymity was the price and purpose of her work. But at FOB Kandahar and throughout Fifth Fleet, her name was known and her example was taught. The shy medic who'd seemed overwhelmed by deployment had been a special forces commander the entire time. The weakness had been performance. The strength had been constant. And everyone who'd witnessed the revelation learned the most important lesson military service could teach. Never assume you know someone's capability based on how they choose to appear. Never mistake quiet strength for actual weakness. And never let arrogance override the basic respect every person deserves regardless of rank or role. Those lessons would echo through careers and commands for years to come, taught by instructors who'd learned them through painful experience and perpetuated by leaders who understood that cultural change required vigilance. The institution had failed once. The reforms ensured it wouldn't fail the same way again. The sun set over FOB Kandahar in shades of orange and purple, illuminating a base where assumptions no longer dictated treatment and weakness was never assumed without proof. Lieutenant Colonel Denning watched the sunset from the command center and thought about Commander Reeves absorbing harassment in silence so that 12 operators could complete their mission safely. That was leadership. That was sacrifice. That was the standard everyone would follow or find themselves standing where Derek Holloway had stood, facing a panel of officers and hearing the word guilty repeated until it erased everything they'd built. The base settled into evening routines, and medical specialist Hawthorne unpacked her equipment in quarters where she felt welcomed instead of judged. The reforms were working. The culture was changing. And somewhere in the world, Commander Adrienne Reeves was preparing to do it all over again because that's what the mission required. That's what real strength looked like.